Thanks, Chris. Morning, everybody. We all good to go? Anybody living in a supply constrained environment? What is this about, you know? This has been one of my favorite topics to talk about because it's such an illustration of the issues that conventional planning and other techniques can bring to companies when kind of markets go crazy like they've been for the last several years. Everybody's been talking a lot about, let's see, supposed to be working. There we go. Kind of the environment of, boy, we got supply issues. In the automotive industry, it was chips. There was a little interesting anecdote where Ford was parking tons of F-150 trucks at a speedway somewhere in Kentucky because they didn't have the badge for the grill. All sorts of stories. And we've talked to so many clients over the last year and a half or so, 2 years, especially through the core time of the pandemic where all hell had broken loose and it was really, really difficult. And so we're going to try to unravel, why is that? How can we be in a supply constrained environment? And yet what we see here is that inventory turnover rates are slowing down. Now, everyone's screaming, we're in a supply constrained environment. If my inventory turnover rates are going down, that means I'm carrying more inventory relative to the rate of demand I have. So our inventory levels are actually going up. So how can this be? We're looking at a number of publicly traded companies, a comparison of where they were in 2020 versus 2021 off their annual reports. See some pretty notable names there. Ford, turns were down 9%, GE 7%, Intel were down 20%, Rockwell 20%, Stanley Tools 42% decline in their inventory turnover rates year over year. One notable exception, Pfizer. Business was good. We're selling the vaccine. Things are flying. Business is doing great. In fact, they were, trying to keep up with the rate of demand. So this is really interesting to me that in spite of the fact that we're all screaming about supply constraints, many clients are actually seeing increases in their inventory levels. So let's figure out why that is happening and what we can do about it. So let's take a look at kind of a few different dimensions, and we're going to look at the change in the rate of activity versus a trend over time, right? So through the pandemic, a lot of companies were kind of plateauing on revenue. They might have been growing coming into the pandemic, but then because of all of the impacts of labor issues and things like that, they weren't able to really continue growing. So revenue considered in a lot of cases is pretty much relatively flat year over year during those couple of years. They were seeing, though, a big increase in the amount of past due demand. You just couldn't service the market for various reasons. You had staffing issues, you had components you couldn't get, you had this massive backlog that keeps growing and growing and growing as you go month by month by month, and you're kind of stuck in this situation, So the opportunity to grow is there, but the rate of past due demand is increasing at a pretty healthy level. And at the same time, they were seeing these increases in their inventories. And they're trying to figure out how in the world can this be happening? We are supply constrained, and there's reasons for it from a planning standpoint that are causing that to happen. And what really triggered this was a conversation we had with a new client that was coming on board right when all of this is surfacing. And they were debating, what should they do with that past due demand? Should they add that to the forecast when they're feeding into their planning system? And what would be the consequence of doing that, right? Well, it sounds like the right thing to do is keep all that demand in there because that's real demand and that will help us understand how far behind we are. But what you're going to find is that if you use that demand for all of your material planning, you are going to have a lot of items that are not constrained, right? So what will you do then? You're planning to that past due demand. You have all these unconstrained materials, they're going to keep coming in, right? The planning system will be balanced because the demand in inventory and open supply will all add up and balance out to zero. But all of a sudden, your balance sheet is going to start looking quite a bit different. So we have supply constraints, and this could be, we're going to use this in the context of external constraints, but this same story can apply around a constrained NPS, which is kind of the whole punchline in this whole message around your internal resources and functions like that. But in this case, most of the cry that you've heard about in the market was it's something outside the four walls of our business. And how can we get better control of that and learn how to understand how to manage in that kind of an environment, right? So we've got supply constraints, but inventory levels are going up and our turnover rates are going down. So we're going to go through an example here just to kind of illustrate how this happens. You're going to see down at the lower left there, a little culprit, purchase item A in this case has a limited supply rate from the vendor of 500 per week. They've said, for all these various reasons, we can only get this much material to you at this rate. And it's important to understand it as a rate of material over time, because that is key to the way you're going to do your planning. All the other items in this finished good assembly, you've got, a sub-assembly A, purchase item B is unconstrained, sub-assembly B and its components is unconstrained, and there's your purchase item E. We have a demand for the finished good at a rate of 1,000 per week. So we're going to use very simple math to kind of illustrate what's going on here. And what we'll do is walk through week by week what's happening. So you'll start to see kind of the impact on our balances in various dimensions as a way of understanding kind of the root cause of the issue. So the market's demanding 1,000 a week. We're going to start out with a buffer. We've buffered item FIA with 2,000 units. So it's got a buffer that gives us 2 weeks of supply to cover the demand that could potentially vary. We can ship, 24 hours after the demand comes in. Purchase item A has a supply constraint rate of supply of 500 per week. It has no inventory to start out, and all of the other items are unconstrained. Okay. So we're going to go through this example. We're going to go week by week here, and hopefully you can see the numbers. Each week, we're going to see a demand signal of 1,000 per week. We know we have a rate of supply of 500 per week for purchase item A. So we can't make 1,000 now. We can only make 500 because we are missing that one component, purchase item A. So that means that we have a backlog of purchase item A that is going to start building up. We're going to have pass-through demand or supply orders that are sitting out there that have been unfulfilled as we go through time. We have a production shortfall of 500. So from our buffer, we had a starting balance of 2,000. We're going to make 500 because that was the supply we had of purchase item A. We're going to have a shortfall of 500, which means that our inventory in our buffer is going down by 500 units, right? That 1 week, we could only produce 500. The market demanded 1,000. So we had a 500 unit shortfall. Now we have a backlog of demand to satisfy and keep that buffer at the 2,000. We're now short 500, right? So the pass-through demand is for the purchased item. We've got a pass-through supply order for purchase item A. And we're going to use everything we get from that vendor each week, right? As we go forward now, what's going to happen is that our production shortfall is going to continue every week. The back order demand or supply orders for purchase item A go up 500 a week, from 500 to 1,000 to 1,500 and so on. By week 4, we have exhausted our buffer. We can no longer service the market demand, right? So now after week 4, we start building up an even greater backlog. You can see we should be at 2,000 in inventory. Now we have that gap of 2,000 from the fact that we're stocked out. We can see that is going to continue to grow because now we have this vast new demand. This continues week over week over week. And by the time we get out to, the week 10, we're 5,000 units behind on purchase or the finished good A. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay, great. So let's see what happens now on purchase item B. We're just going to take one of those other components and see what happens to it. We have a supply order for 1,000, right? Because we have market demand of 1,000, but we were only able to use 500 of them, right? Because that was our limitation from purchase item A. So now we started with an inventory of 1,000, so now we're up to 1,500 after week 2. And as we go forward week by week, we are adding 500 units of inventory to purchase item B. From a demand and supply standpoint, we are in balance, but we're using a lot of cash, right? We are paying for all this stuff that's going to start accumulating every week that we go down this path. CEOs at this time are saying, I don't give a shit, excuse me. I never want to stock out, right? Because sooner or later, we're going to get this supply constraint resolved and we're going to lean into this thing and we're going to continue to carry more inventory because we cannot afford to ever miss when the market comes back, right? Okay, how long do you do that? How long do you use that rationalization before you start to really put yourself in jeopardy? 18 months. Not a week more or a little less, but it's 18 months. It's, because the longer this goes on, obviously the huger your balances get, right? What might be the problem of that happening? What could be some of the knock-on effects that you're going to encounter? Cash, obsolescence, the market's going to change, right? We know that it's going to happen. So my goodness, I don't know if anybody's here with Ford or whatever, but they're building cars, waiting for when they finally get the technology components or whatever they're missing. So they're sitting in lots all over the country. Sooner or later, they're going to get the materials. It may be by the time the next model year comes out, now what are we doing with ourselves? Are we really doing the right thing? And so obviously, I think we should be recognizing this problem and treating it with the right amount of respect. Now, I would absolutely be the first one to say that trying to figure out from a supplier what their committed rate of supply is going to be over a period of time is not an easy task because they're going through the same heartache that you are going through with their own issues, right? Where they have labor problems, they've got components they can't get, whatever. Hoarding is going on in the various markets, influencing all this kind of stuff. But to the degree that we can get to a better understanding of what our rate of supply will be, we will put ourselves into a better place. And this is very hard. A lot of people can do a constrained MPS inside their environment because they've got the resources and they know their limitations on their drum resources and things like that. But once it moves outside, it becomes a lot more challenging, right? So, any of the TOC thinkers out there understand this kind of schedule from Dr. Goldratt? Identify what the constraint is. Figure out what is the part that is limiting our production. We worked through some of this analysis with some of our clients, and we're trying to help them understand, hey, this is where your issue is. So you've got to start to figure out if you can use that as a way to constrain your demand signals so that you don't have the excess accumulation in other areas. But you have to identify the constraint. Not an easy thing to do, especially if you have complex structures and bills of material and different vendors and blah, 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 blah. There's a lot of issues here to this. But I think in certain segments of your business, it would be really useful to get that understood and then start to figure out how to finitely schedule to that rate of supply. If we can do that, because that's the second step, is subordinate to the constraint, right? Subordinate all other activities to the constraint because it allows you to then put your focus on alleviating that, right? And then obviously the next step from a TOC standpoint is elevate the performance. The idea behind TOC that I really resonated with was it's a focusing technique. It helps you really laser in on that piece of the puzzle that is really going to give you the most leverage. Any questions on this? Does this make sense? Find that constraint, manage to it, subordinate all the other activities to that, and then obviously focus on elevating its performance. Whatever we could do. All that working capital we're investing in this inventory that's building up could have been redeployed to maybe figuring out how to make that part ourselves, right? Or find another source or pay more for another source because at least it would allow us to continue production at the rate we'd like to be at. All right. If we constrain to the rate of supply So now we are going to still have the backlog of all this demand that you see. We're still constrained. But now on item B, we are going to stay in balance, right? Because we're going to pace it to that constrained planning signal. That means that the demand you're using in your planning system isn't the actual demand. It's a modified demand based on that constraint, right? And that's kind of a little bit of a nervous thing for some folks because they want to see all the customer orders that are out there and all this stuff. At the end of the day, we end up in a much more balanced position. We don't have this overhanging materials on those other unconstrained items. And we're just showing, for simplicity's sake, one of the several items that we had in that final assembly. Now, so we can do this. It's not easy to accomplish if you don't know where the constraints are, so you have to have the right way to analyze and look for it. Typically, it's going to be those items that have the most past due supply against their record or the most past due demand where they've not been able to satisfy it, right? And it really presents some interesting analysis kind of challenges to figure that out, but you absolutely can do it. So the idea of a constrained master production schedule then says we're going to recognize that we can't yield to the actual demand that's in the market. We're going to build a plan that's achievable based on whatever constraints we have in our supply environment and manage from those. And then obviously focus on elevating the performance of the constraint. One of the other items I've really encouraged people to take a look at is maybe you should clean out some of that past due demand. It is creating noise in your system from a planning standpoint because everything looks in balance, but man, you know, is all of that past due demand really going to be valid? Even though the customer orders are out there, are they absolutely going to salute and, you know, accept all of that material? If this has gone on a long time, which in some cases it's been 18 months or more, geez, I really wonder about the integrity of that data and whether it's going to be of any value for us, right? Okay. So we know there's a problem. It's about getting the right signals in our system. We know there's a way to do that with a constrained MPS. Let's say things start to get better, and let's gain an understanding of how long it's going to take us to work our way out of this situation, right? Because if you think about it, if I've gone back to this example here, and I've got this huge amount of excess inventory that we had in the unconstrained environment, how long is it going to take me to burn that off? I mean, how much upside potential do your vendors have over what their old rate was? Forget the 500, you know, a week constraint plan. They were able to keep up with you at 1,000 per week. How much above that rate are they actually going to be able to get to? Because that's going to determine how long it's going to take you to burn off that extra inventory, right? And I really think there's, you know, laws of gravity here that there's just only so much you can accelerate a production environment. From your suppliers, internally, wherever, you know, because there's only so much resource there to work with. And people, as we've seen in the labor markets, have chosen different journeys in their life and they're not working the same hours. And we've talked about this with Freshmark. They were having staffing issues just like everybody else. It's not going to be an easy situation. So let's think about how long the road to recovery will be. In this case, I just modeled, what if we could go 50% over our previous run rate of 1,000 per week? What if we could get up to 1,500 a week, right? It took us 10 weeks to get into that problem. Now we're going to go forward from week 11, and it takes another 10 weeks to get all the way out of that problem. Meaning, if you think about it kind of philosophically or whatever, however long it took you to get to this place, it's going to be at least that long to get back out of it, or maybe a bit longer, right? And I tried to use this as an example to just help people be cautious about how much did they let the horses run on those unconstrained materials before they got a little itchy about it, right? How far do you lean into that inventory before it really starts to become a bad business decision? If I can understand it's going to be 18 months, 2 years, whatever it is, then I would probably be a lot more more inclined to throttle back sooner than I would have otherwise. And so trying to use this, we did a webinar on this last year, trying to raise people's awareness. It's not an easy problem to solve, but if you don't think about it all the way through, not just getting it under control, but how the road to recovery is going to take so long to get out of it, then I think your decision-making will be influenced in a different way and you have a better approach to handling that. Does this make sense? Easy to say and describe, very difficult to do, but it can be done, right? So in this case, even with a 3x improvement from the constrained supply rate, it's going to take us 10 weeks to recover. As long as it took us to get into this problem, it's going to take us to get it back out. And I think largely, if I've been in a constrained environment for a long time, at least that long it's going to take before we get back out. So beware the risk of buying in excess of immediate need. And what I mean by that is, what can we actually use today? If you continue planning to your past due demands, you're going to continue accumulating inventory, and that's something to be very, very cautious about, right? It's using working capital, and I think that these are financial decisions that you can make. Gosh, maybe a capital investment here to create the capability to address that constraint would be a better investment for us than sticking it in inventory for an uncertain future, right? And obviously the obsolescence risk is very high. So much of this centered, at least from the automotive industry, around chips and the shortages that were so critical to the technology that go into automobiles and vehicles and stuff like that. The electronics industry was hard hit on this. I've seen other wrinkles on it where it wasn't that the material wasn't available, it was that containers to move the material weren't available, right? So there's all sorts of different ways that you're going to find yourself into this situation. And obviously then you're going to have other constraints that may limit the rate of recovery. Anybody who's worked in a TOC concept knows that there's this exposure called a floating constraint, which means that once we get, the idea is identify the constraint, get it under control. But then something else may turn itself into the constraint, right? Because of the way the dynamics in your production environment works. Which means that if I'm trying to manage to this supplier's rate of supply, it may then turn out that there is another gremlin out there that we haven't seen yet that we have to start focusing on, right? What would be that other supply component or an internal process that we don't have the excess capacity to deal with? Be aware of that and just be vigilant about looking for those situations as they come through. All right. Any questions on this? It's just, I think, a very interesting dynamic that people are crying about supply constraints and at the same time they're building inventory. And obviously, if you don't step back and look at the problem in a more diligent way, I think you can put yourself in a real difficult position. There's ways to do this. I was planning to do it for the session today. I've done demonstrations of how you can utilize the S&OP module, setting an external resource as a constraint and building that constrained MPS and then illustrating how it impacts the other components. The problem is that you can't see the data. I would be happy to, in an offline session after the conference, in the coming days, if you want to go through this in more detail, we could show you how the S&OP module can be utilized to generate that constrained MPS. And it would actually factor down the amount of buildup of supply orders for the other unconstrained items that you're worried about over-investing in. The vendor collaboration part of this is probably the most critical. You have to get to a point where you've got a known reliable rate. You got to turn it into a rate because that's obviously going to impact the whole planning system here. But even if it's not on a weekly basis, they say we can ship you 2,000 a month reliably. Now you know how you can factor that in and build out a game plan to work around that. Be diligent and patient. I think where you're starting to see things easing a bit. I mentioned to someone last time, I'm going to try and go buy a car this weekend. And I do see from the websites that there's starting to be a bit more inventory out there of vehicles. So that's promising. They're still probably going to want to ask for a price over list because they think they can do that now. But, I think we're starting to see some easing in the situation. Questions on this?